On this episode, we cover the Joe Rogan Experience 2460 with guest Rachel Wilson. The No Rogan Experience starts now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters, now with 179 hours of Rogan experience, get to know Joe Rogan. It's a show for those who are curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and their claims, as well as for anyone who wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Cecil Cicirello. That's Michael Marshall. And today, we're going to be covering Joe's February 2026 interview with Rachel Wilson. So, Marsh, how did Joe introduce Rachel in the show notes?
Rachel Wilson is a writer, cultural commentator, and media personality. She's the author of Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation.
Okay, is there anything else we should know about?
Yeah, I think there's a few things we should know. So first of all, her husband is Andrew Wilson, who we covered on episode 54. He appeared on Rogan on January 28th of this year. You might remember he was the guy who was on just after ICE killed Alex Pretty. And then they had a whole conversation which essentially justified that and blamed it at most on a misfiring of the gun. Andrew and Rachel are a couple who portray themselves as living a pretty trad Christian lifestyle while running businesses like the debate business that we talked about Andrew Wilson having. They also have YouTube channels apiece. They sell books. They sell access to debating courses that they've written. And during the course of this conversation, Rachel's also going to talk about her Substack that she writes for. And all that is important to note because her whole pitch essentially is that women shouldn't be in the workforce. And yet here she is explaining that while promoting a book that she's written and a course that she's co-written and sells and being the media personality who talks about these things. This is a business for her. I've got no issue with her having a business. She should have an issue with her having a business because that goes against everything she's essentially about.
Right.
There is absolutely more to say about both Rachel Wilson and Andrew Wilson as individuals, but it is worth pointing out this show isn't a deep dive into people's personal biographies. It's more of a critical literary analysis of the text of the conversation that they have with Joe. You know, we're looking at whether what they're saying to him is true and trying to look at the formal structure of the arguments that they make and the rhetoric that they employ on Joe and his audience. So there'll be a load of biographical stuff that we aren't covering because it simply isn't relevant to what this show is, but there's plenty of stuff out there on both Rachel Wilson and Andrew Wilson if you want to know a lot more about them.
So what did they talk about in this episode?
Yeah, it's pretty much all about feminism. They talk about the suffrage movement. They talk about women having babies. They talk about women in the workplace. They talk about abortion. They talk about prominent feminists throughout history and what personal flaws they had. They talk about why falling birth rates, eugenics, Satanism, anxiety, and divorce are actually all the fault of feminism.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into here, and add into that, we're going to have a Toolbox section, so it's going to be a long episode, and we're going to get started soon, but before we get started, we want to thank our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. That's Megan Bray, Chunky Cat in Chicago has claws out, Fred Arguthius, Marsh in the Epstein Files, Color Me Gobsmacked, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one, Billionaire Oligarchs, Stone Banana, Dr. Andrew Gibson, the online physics tutor, Darlene, oh, wow, I can't say that name on our show, Scott Laird, Don't Thank Me, your show is just worth investment, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, Ram Tam Tickler, Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, Morgan Gordon, Matthew Cutler, Autistic Twitch Streamer, Angie Madkey, Left Hand Voodoo, Stargazer 97, Lucy Cortez, and Carissa Gunderson. They all subscribe to patreon.com/NoRogan. You can do that too. All patrons get early access to ad-free episodes and a patron-only bonus segment every single week. And this week, you'll find out which conservative leader Rachel thinks is a liberal feminist. So check it out at patreon.com/NoRogan. But for now, our main event. It's game. Huge thank you to this week's veteran voice of the podcast. That was Yarshik announcing our main event. Remember that you too can be on our show. Just all you have to do is just send us a recording of you giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to NoRoganPod@gmail.com, as well as how you would like to be credited on the show. So we talked about it before. The main event is going to be her discussing with Joe anti-feminism. And she starts out very early in the show. We're 12 seconds in. You'll hear the intro music, and they start talking about Rachel's book.
Hello, Joe.
Very nice to see you again.
Good to see you too.
So when your husband Andrew came in here, he told me about your book, and then I talked to you, and you seemed very interesting, and you gave me like a little brief synopsis of it. And so then I listened to it on audio tape, and it's fucking crazy. And it is the Occult Feminism, the Secret History of Women's Liberation. I didn't really have much of an opinion on feminism. My opinion was, unfortunately, you run into some feminists that just did not like men for whatever reason. And, there's a lot of people in this world that aren't happy with their position or station in life. But I didn't really think too much into how this all got started until I listened to your book. And I'm like, this is kind of bonkers.
So yeah, the framing here, it's worth noting that Joe had Andrew Wilson on the show recently. He was the guy, as we mentioned, defended the murder of Alex Pretty. And while there, Andrew said to Joe, you should get my wife on the show because she's written this book. And here she is now plugging this book. So this is very much kind of a transactional kind of process, essentially, here.
Yeah, and Joe mentions he didn't really have a thought about feminism, really think about feminism too much. Maybe, and taking him at his word, maybe he hasn't consciously thought about feminism, but outwardly mocking women and making voices for women to sound ditzy and relishing when women get yelled at when they tell a story or whatever. I think we already kind of understand where Joe comes from when we talk about feminism. Also, I just want to point out that you can literally write anything down you want in a book and publish it, right? There's plenty of avenues to do those sorts of things. Doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean she's qualified to do any of that stuff. I think that's important to point out. He's making it seem like here she is. She wrote a book. She's an expert. I think we'll find as we work our way through, most of that is not true.
Yeah, anyone can write a book. You wrote a book, for example. Anyone can write.
I wrote a book, for crying out loud. Anybody can do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Marsh is also in that book. He wrote the beginning of that book.
I did.
Marsh wrote the intro to that book. All right.
A tiny bit.
Okay. So here we are. We're going to move on. It's not much longer. They do talk a little bit back and forth. They sort of get to know each other a little. And then she starts talking about her background. And she talks about how she wanted to have a baby. And she wound up having a baby.
But I ended up having a baby at 20, which again was the end of the world. Oh my God, Rachel, your life is over. You'll never be anything. You'll never do anything. It's over for you. It's such a tragedy. It was like treated like this horrible thing. And I thought it was great. And when I had her, the job that I had did not matter to me anymore at all. It seemed so stupid. It was like anybody can go. I was a hairstylist at the time. Anybody can go do haircuts. Someone else can cut Debbie's hair, but only I can be her mom. I want to do that. And everybody was telling me, you have to go back to work. You have to go back to work. That's what we do now. 2 weeks after the baby's born, you got to go back to work. You need the money. You need the security. You need the income. And I looked around and thought, this is insane. Like, who came up with this system? Because I am going to go drop her off at 2 weeks old and let some lady who doesn't know or care about or love my baby the way that I do take care of her all day long. If you factor in the commute, it's like 9.5 hours that I'm away from her. By the time I get home and feed her and give her a bath, it'll be bedtime. And that'll be it. I'll get like maybe 2 hours with my baby all day. And I get to pay half of what I make to this other random person to raise my child. Who came up with this? This is stupid. And I have to pay taxes, and I have to have a second vehicle and insurance and a work wardrobe. And I just thought, this is the most inefficient, stupid system. And everyone around me is like, this is good. This is what we all need to do.
Okay, so it's worth pointing out, Nobody is saying that this is a great system. Nobody is saying that that's a perfect system. Nobody's defending the system of having to pay a huge amount for childcare. That is certainly not what, as she'll go on and be anti-feminist throughout this conversation, it's certainly not what feminists would say is the perfect system at all. There are a lot of feminists who would criticize that system. She says it's insane. I agree it is insane that you're having to go back to work 2 weeks after giving birth. But I would argue that's because your country doesn't have adequate maternity pay. We have reasonable maternity leave and things like that. In Scandinavia, for example, people can get, I think it's like a year off, and that can be split between maternity and paternity. There's much more support for parents. That is a better system. What this is to me, and this could have almost been the Toolbox, there's so many examples of it, where she highlights a real issue, but then attributes it to either the single false cause or gives it the single false solution.
Yeah.
It is a real issue that women are forced into the workplace immediately after giving birth. Feminists want you to have the right to choose not to have to do that. So here's an idea. What if the childcare didn't cost the earth if you wanted to carry on working?
Yeah.
What if people who had no money didn't have to take jobs that had like crushing hours just to be able to make ends meet, so that people could choose to raise their own kids? That world can exist. It would also be a socialist world, and you'd be decrying it, essentially.
Yeah. That's a real important key piece here, is that throughout this episode, she tries to tie feminism to communism as if that's a way to defame feminism, right? She's trying to say it's based in sort of this communist ideology, and that is the way in which she says that it's a bad thing. She's tying those two things together to say we shouldn't listen to anybody who thinks feminism is right. And really what she's describing is how capital basically grinds people up and spits them out. That's what she's describing here. And our country actually used to have a system where one person could work and the other did the housework and the raising of the kids. And that system was stolen away by a series of Republicans that allowed businesses to underpay people and busted most of the unions in the country. So now you don't have those options anymore. Now you have to have two motors in every boat in order for it to move forward. Because if you don't, you're going to wind up destitute, essentially. There's no real, Joe has talked multiple times about how he doesn't want to give people handouts. They've attacked people who are on SNAP. This is literally like the only way some people can get by. And I just want to mention that conservatives do want you to stay home, right? They want you to stay home with your child. They just want you to be poor when you do it. They want you to live in poverty. And now because of the cost of childcare, it can sometimes be a loss for someone to actually go to work than instead to stay home. They could go to work, make literally no money because all that money would go to childcare. Universal pre-K could solve a lot of this, but nobody wants to ever do that in our country. Again, these are socialist programs that could change things, but you've demonized socialism so much that we can't even bring it up.
Yeah, and she's going to pick up on issues like that, where there's a genuine issue somewhere at the bottom of all of this, but her solution to it would not make things better and would only make them worse.
Right. So this is going to lead them into a discussion about something that gets talked about a lot on Joe's show. Now they're going to bring up falling birth rates.
I think we give women backwards advice. I think we tell them, spend all your fertile years, all your youth, building a career, going to school and building a career. Then by the time you're like 30, 35 and you've got all that established, then you can think about getting married and having kids. Well, by then, you better find somebody quick and get on it because you got a handful of years left.
Yeah.
And you might need IVF and all these other things. And a lot of women struggle. And it's actually, nobody wants to talk about this. This is the conversation no one's ready for. Women's access to higher education is the number one correlate around the world, regardless of economics, race, culture, status, anything, to falling birth rates.
Wow.
So again, she's picking up on a real issue here that women are being forced to try and have it all, to put off your career, put off having kids till you've got a career. Otherwise, you won't be able to get a start on the ladder. But if you do that, it can be quite difficult to conceive later on. Feminists would agree that this is a problem, but what you're proposing is not the solution to that. You're proposing the solution that women just get out of the workforce, and we will hear that as we come to it. And then she comes to this this thing about, the thing that nobody wants to talk about is that women's access to higher education is the number one correlate around the world to falling birth rates. This is a perversion of a specific statistic. It's true, but it's a slightly perverted skew on that statistic. If you go to parts of the world and you do things like raise women's education educational access, but also raise their access to contraception. And if you lower infant mortality, what you'll find is people there will have fewer babies. But that's because it means you're able to control when you have babies, and it's not just at the behest of your relationship. And every time you have sex, you might be falling pregnant as a result. And it also means that people won't have to have 6, 7, 8 kids in order to guarantee some of them will make it to adulthood because you've lowered infant mortality. So this isn't necessarily about, depopulation, as she seems to be sort of spinning it. Like, if you educate women, you get falling birth rates. It's saying if you want to control, if you want to help with out of control overpopulation of somewhere, the way to do that is to give women access to education and the freedom to say what happens to their own body, which in themselves, those are good things to themselves, but have this other benefit of meaning that our population doesn't explode.
Yeah, and declining population, you know what that means, Marsh, is they're going to have to replace you eventually. Who would they replace you with? Maybe an immigrant or something. It might be exactly what we're taught. What gets brought up on Joe's show all the time, right? Like, we talk about his relationship to the Great Replacement Theory and how he constantly talks about that sort of thing. And this is another thread that weaves in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes up a lot with the Great Replacement Theory is that, well, the falling birth rates, they aren't complaining that it's women in the Middle East or women from South America, Hispanic women from South America who have falling birth rates, or women in Africa who have falling birth rates. They're usually complaining about the falling birth rates of white women in Europe. And this often sort of goes hand in hand with the memes of white women in Europe, in cartoons of them in the abortion waiting room, next to cartoons of women who are heavily pregnant with multiple kids who are brown-skinned in a maternity ward, and saying, well, only one of these women has falling birth rates. It's edging in that direction without ever sort of making the dog whistle obvious.
I want to go back to one thing you said, which I think is a thread throughout this entire episode, is that feminism agrees with what you're saying and it's bad, right? Yep. Much of what she's going to complain about is that she's going to say, well, there's women have to bear the burden of pregnancy, and so they have to get out of the workforce. And feminism is the thing that points that out, because that is an unequal way in which society treats women, right? That's what feminism is trying to get equality for women. That's the bottom line. I know she's going to try to twist it into all kinds of crazy shit this episode, but that's the bottom line. And feminists would agree with her that women bear the burden of childcare and child rearing and childbirth, and they are the ones who are pulled out of the workforce. And we should, as a society, work towards better solutions than just, well, sucks to suck. That's what we should be trying to do. Instead, she's going to blame feminism as if it's its fault because women have this unequal burden. No, feminism is the way to fight against that unequal burden. And that's something I think she misses throughout this entire episode. Well, I think purposefully misses, but we could give her the benefit of the doubt and say maybe she's just misunderstanding it. You can complain that women don't start families earlier. We talked that it was economically viable before. It's not anymore. But even nowadays, if you were to marry and start a family and try to stay home in your 20s with one entry-level job as the salary, that would be very difficult. So people, even if they want kids and they want to have a better place, they want to be in a better place monetarily before they can make that decision. This has very little to do with feminism and much to do with economy.
Yeah, it does. But also, even if that wasn't true, if it was possible to raise kids with only one wage, that world that you're looking back to means that wage is only coming into one half of that couple. And it's not the half that had to take the time off to have the kids. So what this inevitably does is lock women into financial relationships where they're dependent on a man. And sometimes that'll be fine, but a lot of the times that won't necessarily be fine.
Great point. All right. So they're still talking about economics here. Now they're talking about the cost of living.
Isn't there also a practical consideration for a lot of people? Because the cost of living is very different now than it was, like, say, in the 1950s or the 1960s. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult for a lot of people to get by on one income.
Yes, it is. But have you ever asked why that is?
I have, but I'd love to hear you talk about it.
So prior to the 1970s, we had 5% of mothers with school-age kids working outside the home. And for all of human history, even during the Industrial Revolution, 17, 18, 1900s, like you said, in the 40s and 50s, you could be a janitor and support a family and have 4 kids on one income. And something shifted in the 1970s, and it's never shifted back. So it can't be like how the stock market's doing. It can't really be like all these other independent economic factors that have shifted and changed and been so different over the course of the last 50 years. The one big thing that we changed is we pushed women into college and into the workforce. And by the 1980s, they were on par with men in workforce participation. So in the span of about 20 years, we almost doubled the labor force by pushing all the women in, and men's wages have never recovered. So now you are stuck in a 2-income trap where even women who want to stay home and even dads who would love to have their wife home with their kids, it's really tough.
Yeah, and as everybody knows, if you double the number of people doing something, you get less done, and therefore there's less value around. It's not necessarily tied in that way. That isn't how it works. But here she's saying the one big thing that we changed is women in the workforce. Nothing else. It's not the stock market. It's one big thing that we changed is in the entire economy over the last 50 years or more was just women entering the workforce. Now, what she overlooks there, neoliberalism, Ronald Reagan's presidency in your country, Thatcher in my country, offshoring, globalization, technological advancement, putting people out of work, financial crashes. There's been several of those. Wars, hypercapitalism, wealth disparity, and a pandemic. It's none of those things. It's the lasses. It's the lasses being at work.
It definitely is. Yeah, exactly.
That's harming things. As I said, this almost could have been a Toolbox segment of its own, where she identifies a real problem, that wages are stagnating, but she attributes it to the wrong cause or attributes a complex problem to a simplistic single cause that's actually got, at most, only a small part of it, if any part at all. In reality, the big issue that she's not talking about is the huge concentration of wealth into a minority of society. And that has ballooned over the last 50 years. I'll put a link in the show notes about the distribution of household wealth in the US from 1989 onwards, and you can see the amount of wealth held by the bottom 50% of America has barely changed as a percentage, but the amount that's been, as a number of trillions of dollars rather, but the amount that's being held by the 90% plus, the 99% plus, or the top 0.1% has ballooned. Maybe that's why people's wages are stagnating, because there's people out there on Joe's guest list, essentially, who are taking up all that money for themselves.
Yeah, in her world, a bunch of women entered the workforce and no one created any new jobs. And then men and women all just agreed to a half wage and then we never recovered.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are in the corner of the room hoping you don't notice
Peter
them.
Thiel has his own vice president that he controls. Yeah. Okay. Now she's going to talk for a minute about women in the workforce.
So why did women entering the workforce keep men's wages stable or keep them from going up along with the inflation?
It really fundamentally changed the economy. I have a friend named Aaron Clary who wrote a book about this. It's an analysis of what he calls a female-based economy, where it's more consumer-driven. Women are responsible for 80% of consumer spending. And now that they're all educated and in the job market, we have a lot more of things like HR departments, psychology, sociology. The economy shifted away from being manufacturing and production and more male-dominated things to we have all these women coming out of university, and what do they get degrees in? I think 80% of psychology degrees are earned by women. And then despite all our efforts to push women into STEM, there's still maybe 20% of STEM degrees. So we have all these very educated women, and we have a lot of kind of fluffy jobs like office jobs, HR jobs, social media managers. And mostly women do a lot of the same things they used to do in the home. So they're nurses, they're early childhood educators, they're retail workers, they're cooks, they're housekeepers. They're doing a lot of the stuff they used to do, which the Marxist feminists called unpaid labor, right? This is the myth of women's unpaid labor. So instead of cleaning your own house, educating your own children, cooking meals for your family, maybe for your parents or grandparents who can't cook for themselves, all the things we used to do for our own family, clerical work, bookkeeping for your husband's business, things like that. We're doing those things for corporations.
I mean, I will point out when we listened to RFK's interview just last episode, he was saying that these days cooking for your grandparents is something that Medicare will pay you to do, and that's where all the Medicare fraud is. So I'm not quite sure exactly whether these two have had a conversation about their worldview.
Great pull. Bravo.
She talks about her friend having written books, this guy called Aaron Clarey. I looked up a couple of his books. I think I found them. I can put links in the show notes to them. One is A World Without Men, an analysis of an all-female economy. The other of his books that I could find was called The Book of Numbers, analyzing the return on investment on the pursuit of women. And I don't think I need to go much beyond, because I think that title alone shows you what kind of slant we're coming from here.
Absolutely.
But she says about how women are responsible for 80% of consumer spending. Now, that is a figure from the World Economic Forum white paper. It was written by a venture capitalism firm, so it's kind of interesting to hear a Rogan guest citing the WEF and a venture capitalist firm in this kind of way. I've got some skepticism about that figure. Its source being a venture capitalist firm that was specifically using that figure in order to justify its investment strategies. That's the only place I could find as a source of that. It gets repeated in lots of places.
Right.
Perhaps there was an original point beyond that that started before this report. But this is where that figure appears in this white paper. Here's a quote from it. Women are increasingly likely to be the primary breadwinner, financial contributor, and head of the household, making 85% of day-to-day spending decisions and 80% of healthcare spending decisions for the family. So that is what it's saying here. Now, I don't doubt that a lot of women do make purchasing decisions for the family. But that's because it's things like groceries and toiletries and clothing that the kids are wearing. That's all seen as women's work by a lot of men. So this isn't that women have an 80% dominance of the economy because they're earning so much money. It's because they will continue to do the unpaid labor of buying the kids' clothes and buying the weekly groceries in a lot of households. That's what this is about. And when capitalist firms are talking about the women controlling the spending, what they're saying is we should target our ads more towards women than men because that's where we're most likely to affect a purchasing decision for the entire household.
Sure.
So yeah, she's out here agreeing that it should be women's work to do all of those things, you know, picking out the clothes for the kids and getting the groceries and the toiletries, but she shouldn't be paid for that. And she's demonizing society for the fact that women are doing that. So like, pick a lane. Is it women's work to be doing those things for the household, or is it bad that women are controlling the purchasing decisions on those things you think they should be doing? It's not a coherent worldview because she hasn't, in my opinion, fully thought this through, despite having written a book about it and going on Joe Rogan to promote that book. She says about manufacturing. You know, these days it's all HR and sociology and psychology, and it used to be manufacturing. The economy didn't shift away from manufacturing because women entered the workforce. I mean, for one thing, my mum has worked in a factory her entire career. She's always worked in manufacturing as a minimum wage, like factory working job. So manufacturing can be women's work as well. But the reason your economy and my economy of my country shifted away from manufacturing is because it was cheap to offshore things in economies where you pay people less. This isn't feminism at fault. It's capitalism in fault. At fault. When you can say, let's send this off to Indonesia and China and various other parts of East Asia because they'll work for less. That is what's happening here. Like, I imagine if she checked the labels on the clothes that she's wearing or checked the brands of the microphones and the other tech that's around her during her interview with Rogan, not many of them would be manufactured in the US. They'd have been offshore. That's what happened here. And she's saying, women are mostly in nursing, retail, cleaning, cooking, childcare. That's what women are good for in the workplace. Well, it's true those sectors do skew towards women still, but partly that's because women have been locked out of other jobs.
Right.
And that there is a stereotypical assumption that women should be doing that work, and therefore there are fewer gates kept to keep them, barriers to keep them from doing that work than there are for other jobs.
If only there was some system of thought that wanted equality of the sexes, huh? That'd be crazy.
Exactly. I mean, just look at things like STEM careers. There's a famous thing called the leaky pipeline in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. That leaky pipeline is all about how men and women will start off with broadly similar levels of STEM interests, accounting for the stereotypical ways that women are socialized in society and men are socialized in society from being quite young. But when they go to university, if they start off with a large cohort of women in a certain area, over time, women will get lost from the system due to things like bias and stereotyping or a lack of support. The lack of support around things like childcare, assumptions about what their capabilities are. And along the way, they'll drop out. And so you've got a system that was male-dominated historically that is now still male-dominated at the top. And therefore, those people at the top are men who make the decisions as to which faces fit. And surprise, surprise, they pick people like them, and the women are continued to be kept out. So, that is why there is a disparity in a lot of industries. And the last point I'll make, and I think this is an important one this has all been an important clip to take apart in this kind of way. But she says, and now women are out there in the workforce cleaning for corporations instead of for their family. And I don't think it's an instead. It's not like the women who are working as cleaners are going home and not cleaning their house. It's not like the people who are cooks in a company are going home and not cooking for their kids. It's as well as, unless they have a relationship where the men actually do their half of the work, which unfortunately isn't as many relationships as it ought to be. So it's women doing more of the work, and she's missing all of this with this incredibly simplistic version of the world that she's putting forward of, it all went wrong when we allowed women in the workplace.
So I know we've been talking at this point for about 30 minutes, and we're only 6 clips in. They are only 23 minutes in at this point. And this is when Rachel brings up the idea that it's all connected, man. It's all planned out. And so this is that piece.
So that, and this was kind of by design. A lot of the book is about the fact that there were people who pushed feminism, and it wasn't because women were oppressed and they cared about the position of women necessarily. It's because the same people who pushed, the 19th Amendment and pushed progressivism and feminism were the same people who drafted the Federal Reserve legislation, came up with the income tax, came up with the compulsory education system. And especially on the Marxist side, they pushed feminism because they said, if we can push mothers and women into the workforce and we double the workforce, workers of the world unite. You know what I'm saying? So it's like we have this huge workforce, and through the university systems, we can kind of propagandize the young women to be socialists and to be Marxists, because they kind of tend that way anyway. The way that women's brains work is very communitarian for a reason. We're moms, So it's very easy to radicalize. And this isn't my opinion. I go over in the book how you can just read the writings of these people, and they tell you. August Bebel, Alexandra Kollontai, Margaret Fuller, all these early 1800s writers were saying, we need to get women away from the home and away from being mothers and push them into the workplace, because then we can politicize them. We can motivate them into becoming revolutionaries. And that's how we'll get the numbers to make this work.
Wow.
Yeah. So now, instead of staying home with your kids and doing all these things for your family, for your community, you're doing them for a corporation, and you're paying income tax. You're paying all the other taxes associated with having to work outside the home, gas tax because you're driving back and forth to work, payroll taxes, all that kind of stuff. And you are away from your kids all day. Where do they go? They go to public schools, where the public school system then can dictate to them what the values should be, what the worldview should be, instead of the parents.
Hoy.
Yeah.
Hoy, indeed, Joe. So it's worth playing. We played that. That was a real reasonably long clip, but I think it's important to play in its entirety there, because that is the crux of the worldview she's putting forward. And it is essentially a conspiracy theory designed to discredit feminism and the pursuit of equality by making it out like this was all about indoctrinating women and widening tax bases. They didn't really care about the women. They just wanted a wider tax base and also to revolutionize people for their particular fight. Even to the point where I think she's arguing that the women who pushed feminism were Marxists who created the Federal Reserve. That appears to be the argument she's making there. And again, this isn't a coherent worldview other than feminism bad, Marxism bad. all the things you dislike are bad, and they're all connected, and it's all deliberate. And even to the end there,
for
saying,
the toolbox.
Yeah, exactly. We'll absolutely come back to that. And even that goes to say that, and once women are out of the way and aren't educating the kids, well, the government can come in and therefore can indoctrinate things, indoctrinate your kids too, which is, again, part of this push we've seen for homeschooling in the Christian nationalist space. And this is kind of playing into that. But this idea, again, even though, she's speaking as a woman, it's got this incredibly, either naive, patronizing, dismissively simplistic view of what it is to be a woman, saying women are easy to radicalize into communism because they're mothers. They've got a mothering instinct. So, of course, they want to, be communal and get along and things. Maybe it's that people who experience oppression are more likely to join struggles against oppression. Yeah. And when you grow up around oppression and you grow up where your personhood isn't fully valued, you'll join movements that seek to give you equality.
This feels like a long con. I'll get into it in a second here, but she was in the system, and so are a lot of women who agree with her. So why didn't it indoctrinate her? Why did it miss her, right? She's saying that there's all this indoctrination going around, but she somehow broke free of it. But it's not just her. There's a bunch of women out there who also agree with what she has to say. So it's not like this indoctrination is a vice grip that holds people down, if that's the case. It's pretty weak indoctrination when you come right down to it. This long con requires that first we need women to vote. So we have to actually fix that. Then they can enter the workforce in large numbers, but not right away. It has to be 50 or 60 years after they get the right to vote. And then we can get more taxes and indoctrinate their kids after that happens. But it's going to be it's a real long distance here. It feels like the lady that swallowed the spider to catch the fly. It just feels like it's Rube Goldberg. It's built on such unsteady foundation. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that this, in my opinion, is the problem with someone who's probably not actually educated, almost definitely not educated in history, looking at things in the rear view, because you can paste motivations on things in hindsight so that your current point of view was planned out by people rather than it just sort of being this system of really chaotic, really different forces and different personalities that play against things, and then change happens. This is like planning out a butterfly effect of a feminism conspiracy, right? You're planning this out long time ago and planting this one little seed that then grows into it, instead of a bunch of factors working together that weren't actually working together consciously. They just happen to work together in history to create this thing. I think we were putting motivations on it, almost like you're anthropomorphizing history to say it had its own motivations. And I think that's just a bad way to look at it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're absolutely right there. And I think one of the ways we can show that is when she's explaining all these little bits of it, I imagine to a lot of Joe's viewers, it feels like what she's saying makes perfect sense. But I think if you were to stop and say, talk me through what that worldview looked like. Stop to one of the people listening, just that thing that you listened to and believed. Talk me through what it actually was. Talk me through the steps of it. I think they'd struggle to put the pieces back together for themselves. And that's because those pieces only fit together if you're putting them together in a certain way, under certain pressures and certain forces from certain angles. But the second you're left with just the pieces and you've got to reconstruct the picture, you can't get there because it's not a complete jigsaw.
Yeah, and I mean, you certainly sat down with the purpose of confirming your own biases that feminism was bad when you sat down to write the book. You didn't sit down to write the book and just, I was really interested in all these feminist leaders, so I read the history and that turned it on its head for me. That wasn't how you approached this book. You sat down to write a book that was anti-feminist. So you went out and found these feminist authors, and then you found things that confirmed your own biases. We'll get into it later, but you found things that tried to confirm your own biases, and this is just the culmination of that. You put it all together in one big sort of collage. Okay, next bit here, talking about women's education.
For example, let's do a little myth busting. People have this idea that prior to the 19th Amendment, women were denied an education. Completely untrue. Some of the first universities in the United States were exclusively female universities and seminaries and secondary schools. More women actually probably had the opportunity to go than men, because men always had to work in the fields, in the mines, go to war, build the infrastructure of the nation, work on railroads, So women were seen as like, well, you're going to be teaching the kids, so you should probably do a little extra education. Whereas Jimmy and Billy, they need to work the farm with dad, you know. So there was never any law that prohibited women from higher education. What feminists do, they rely on framing. So they'll say, because there weren't co-ed universities, because it was women's universities and then men had separate ones, it was mostly segregated. They'll say women didn't have equal access to education.
Were the better schools men's schools?
No. In fact, I'd say, so I guess you could say there were a handful of Ivy League institutions that didn't let women into certain programs. But it was mostly like medical stuff, things like that. And that had already changed before the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women were already being let into Ivy League education, being allowed to do biology and become doctors. Many of the women in my book who were first wave suffragists had degrees, had educations.
Okay, so the 19th Amendment was about voting. It didn't have anything to do with education. So she brings that up here as if it's tied. They're not tied together necessarily. It's about voting. That's specifically what the language is. I want to mention that I looked up some of these Ivy League universities. So I thought, well, when did they start to, when were the Ivy League universities admitting women to their programs? So Princeton started admitting women in 1969. That's many, many years after the women got the right to vote. Yale, 1968. Brown University became co-ed in 1971. Dartmouth in 1972. Harvard had a separate college for women until 1977, and Columbia University it wasn't until 1983 that women were allowed in. So these are important points to point out, that these are the most prestigious universities in our country, and they had no access for women, or they had different access for women. So we all know about the separate but equal days of the United States. I think we can understand what separate but equal might mean for women's education versus men's education. It's something important to remember, that it's not the same education that men were getting. It's a different education, and often a substandard education, because the college has a different name. So if I go somewhere with Harvard's sister school, that's not Harvard, guys. That's Harvard's sister school. That's a big difference on my diploma versus Harvard. So all that's really important to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially like when Joe is saying, were the better schools men's schools? And she says no. And I'm fairly sure, I'm not confident because I've never been through the American education system, but I imagine that Harvard was considered a better school than Harvard's sister school or the places that weren't Harvard. So I think that was just an untruth from her there.
Yeah.
And also, while a lot of these places would have allowed women at a certain point, there's a difference between being allowed and being welcomed.
Absolutely.
And so there's tolerated, there's
Absolutely.
what was the experience like for the women who were the first ones able to attend these universities whilst allowed. I don't imagine that was welcomed with open arms and made to feel equal.
Yeah. And I mean, you could just point to, even if they did have access to education like she suggests, right? Like, let's presume that what she's saying is true. Even still, women didn't have access to levers of power in society. So they might have been more educated on whole, but they didn't have access to any of the levers of society to change anything. So again, they don't have any of the avenues in which to use their education. So I think, like, when she says this and when she brings this up, what she's trying to say is that women were always equal. They always had the exact same rights that they do today. It's just that feminists want to push women out of having children, and that isn't true. Next, we're going to voting, because we were talking about the suffrage movement, and so this is the next piece.
And the things they predicted would happen, the anti-suffragists said, you're going to see a lot of divorce. You're going to see broken up families, because it's going to pit husband and wife against each other, just like it did with my parents, where you've got, mom wants to vote for the Democrat, dad wants to vote for the Republican, or vice versa. Now they're fighting about it. They want to split. They have separate worldviews, and political interests will be used to drive a wedge between men and women and break up families. And then we're all going to be a bunch of single moms. We're all going to have to work. Like, they literally predicted this stuff. It's in one whole chapter of the book is dedicated to their arguments.
How did they have such amazing foresight? I mean, I just would, ignorantly, I would think, okay, well, I think women should have the right to vote. They're human beings. They live here. There's laws that are being, like, why would that?
Well, I think one of the problems we have when we look back at history is the fallacy of presentism. We're looking at it through like our eyes now with with all of the presuppositions that we have about the world kind of baked in. And at this time, so in 1920, people don't realize that men had only universally gotten the right to vote very shortly before women got it. So in the UK, most men couldn't vote until about 10 years before women got the vote in the UK. There was all kinds of restrictions on voting in the United States for men. You may have to pay a poll tax. You might have to take a test, like a literacy test or a political literacy test. There might be a religious requirement of some kind. There might be a racial requirement of some kind. There could be all different kinds of restrictions on men voting. You might have to be a property owner. You might have to be a certain age. So there was a lot of men. It wasn't like all men could always vote and no women could ever vote. And at the time of trying to pass suffrage, there were already a few states in the West that had granted women suffrage, like Utah and Wyoming.
So she starts off with a point about divorce there. And the anti-suffragists would say once you give women that kind of power to vote, you're going to see a lot of divorce and families breaking up. And that happened. And she's right that happened. But I would argue that that's because prior to that, women weren't really able to separate themselves in relationships where it wasn't healthy for them to be in those relationships anymore because they didn't have the power of autonomy. They couldn't get things like bank accounts to themselves. So women were more likely to be kept in relationships that they had no right to be, that wasn't good for them to stay in because they had no options. So it is right that divorce went up, but those are probably good divorces. And when Joe has brought this up in the past, or when it's been brought up around Joe in the past, he said some divorces are good divorces. Not everybody was made to stay together, but he overlooks that here because of the way that it's being framed. But she's saying about the vote. Well, women, it's not like men had always had the vote, is the argument that she's making. There were lots of restrictions on men. One of those restrictions he's talking about is a racial restriction. So she's saying, look, we weren't allowing women to vote, but it's fine. We were racist as well, guys. So it's like legit, it's fine. Like maybe both those things are bad. And maybe we should bear that in mind.
Right.
But it is true with some caveats that men had some restrictions on voting while women weren't allowed to vote. But it's worth pointing out, she's talking about the UK here initially. She's talking about the UK kind of system, how men couldn't vote till 10 years before women got the vote. Prior to the 1832 Reform Act, it was actually perfectly legal for women to vote in the UK because it just wasn't written down that you had to be any particular gender to vote. But in that, and so there are instances throughout history, although fairly occasional, pretty rare, where women did vote. You had other restrictions on things like owning land, and that's what actually kept women from being able to routinely vote rather than anything else. But up until that point, it was actually legal for women to vote, although it didn't happen very often. But in 1832, they passed the Reform Act, which specifically banned women from voting at that point because the act defined a voter as a male person. So it was only until that point that women were banned from voting, that women were denied the vote until 1832. Theoretically, they were fine before that. At that point, 2 in 5 men were unable to vote. Voting was limited to men over the age of 21 who owned property or paid rates. But also there was a thing called plural voting, where one person is able to legally vote more than once. In terms of, if you happen to have ownership of a business or a higher education, you were allowed to vote multiple times. So that's how they kind of ensured that power was embedded amongst wealth, rather. That voting power, you got more voting power the wealthier you were. And if you were poor, you weren't allowed to vote at all. So if you were receiving any relief for being poor, you were disqualified from voting. So there were ways of keeping men from voting. But then the Representation of the People Act came in 1918. That removed the property qualifications for men, but men still need to register. And it was replaced with just residence, basically. You just had to live there. Women still weren't able to. And then the Conservative government of Stanley Baldwin oversaw the final extension of universal adult suffrage through the Representation of the People Act of 1928, saying, Baldwin said at the time, "I used to vote against women's suffrage. I was taught by the war, which taught me many things." So basically, the First World War, as a response to that, people learned, actually, there's a lot that women can do, and we should give them the right to vote. So all of that being said, what is her point here? What point does she bring this up in order to make? Is her argument that a century ago, it took 10 years for a country on the other side of the world to realize that women should have the vote. Therefore, women in the US shouldn't have got the vote, shouldn't be able to vote. Like, what is her argument here?
Yeah.
She's saying, it didn't used to be the case that men could vote either, right? But like, looking back, you might be doing this presentism where you're looking at today and looking back, but you're arguing about what should be happening now. So is your argument that you shouldn't have the vote here?
Right. Yeah.
Her story, like what we could say, in fact, is just that story she's talking about there illustrates that the entire worldview that she's going to espouse throughout the course of this interview was recognized as outdated by a conservative prime minister a century ago. Stanley Baldwin could look at what she's saying now and say, well, obviously that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't think we should be doing that anymore 100 years ago.
Okay, so they're still talking in this next clip about women and voting.
And the anti-suffragists, this was a big deal. So pro-suffrage women would go to Utah and anti-suffrage women would go to Utah and they'd talk to the women and try to, because everyone's trying to get them on their side. And they kind of found that like women really didn't want to be involved in politics. They felt like we have so much going on at home. They were the community organizers. We don't have this anymore, by the way. I'm taking care of my grandparents. I'm taking care of my uncle who, has a disease and is infirmed. I've got 7 kids and so does my cousin and so does my sister. And we all raise them kind of together. We're very busy. We're doing all the church stuff. We're teaching the kids together. Politics is just like, you have to know so much about it and you have to be so informed. And we don't have time and we really don't have interest. Most of them were really indifferent. But more were either indifferent or against it than were for it by such a margin. So this is the test. They let them vote on whether they wanted the vote in the biggest referendum was in Massachusetts. So they let women vote on whether they wanted the vote in a referendum. Of the women that showed up, not a lot of them showed up. It was a fairly smallish number, but of the thousands that showed up to vote, only 4% wanted suffrage on the ballot.
That's crazy.
Only 4%. So guess what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did after that? All the pro-suffrage leaders, they banned women from voting on whether they wanted to vote. Isn't that crazy?
Okay, the argument she's making through a lot of this is, well, the thing is politics, it's just too complicated for the lady brain. It's just too complicated. There's so many things going on. Yeah. I've got too much to do. I can't pay attention to all these men with different names. All these identical looking white men from the same parts of America who seem to like rule the fucking world. Also, she says, because I've got 7 kids. Like back then, people would have 7 kids and they had family to look after and they're too busy. And again, it's pointing out that lower infant mortality and access to contraception and access to education makes a huge difference to the equality of women. She's saying that right here, but she's saying it in the reverse. Like we shouldn't have that because women shouldn't have access to that education because otherwise they might be able to comprehend politics with their lady brains. So she's trying to make a direct play in the opposite direction here. And she talks about this referendum on, the suffragists, the people who wanted women to vote. And when they asked them to come out to vote, very few of them actually came out and they all voted. Only 4% voted in favor of it. Now, she's making it sound like this was a vote just among women. That's how I interpreted what it sounded like when I heard that
so that's
clip.
what it sounds like she's saying.
Yeah. Maybe listeners heard it a different way, but that's what it sounded like. Like they asked women to vote on whether they got to vote or not. And only 4% wanted suffrage on the ballot of those who vote. Most didn't bother voting, or of those who voted, only 4% wanted suffrage. That isn't true. And in fact, that's not even what the 4% was. I think she has got the wrong end of the stick here because I think she might have misread the Wikipedia page for this, or certainly misread a source somewhere in the many hours and hours of research she did in writing her book. She said she spent 2.5 years reading everything to write this book. This is from the Wikipedia page. On the 5th of November 1895, Massachusetts held a referendum on allowing women to vote in municipal elections. The referendum failed 36.7% to 63.24%. Women were allowed to vote on the measure. However, only 4% of them did so. That's the only 4% here. So yeah, only 4% voted on this. But that isn't to say that 96% who voted didn't want this. It's saying that only 4% of eligible women were able to, actually turned out to vote here. That's the only 4%. In actuality, this was an advisory, non-binding question. This wasn't like the kind of referendum where whatever the outcome is, we enforce it. It was just a, what do you think about this? And the turnout was like 297,000 of them. 23,000 of those votes were from women. There were 600,000 women who were eligible to vote. At the time, actually, anti-suffragists heavily discouraged women from voting, and maybe that's kind of contributed to it. It's hard to say. 274,000 men voted. So of those voters, the 274,000 men, 32% of them voted in favor of women's suffrage. Of the 22,000 women who voted, 96% voted in favor of women's suffrage. So actually, universally, the ones who turned out, they absolutely did vote for this. But the measure failed. It was an embarrassment to suffragists. So what happened? According to Rachel, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony banned women from voting on referendums on this in the future. How? How did they ban them? They had no power to do that. They were women. They didn't even have the vote.
They didn't even have a right to vote.
It wasn't those women who banned anything at all.
Huh.
And in fact, here's another quote from from Ballotopedia. Between 1867 and August 18th, 1920, 54 ballot measures to grant women suffrage were on the ballot in 30 states. 15 of the ballot measures were approved, giving women the right to vote in 15 states. Since women didn't have suffrage until after the ballot measures were approved, male voters decided the outcome of suffrage ballot measures.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's how it would work, huh?
But again, I'm going to do what I did last time, leaving all of that aside. So what? Let's say that 100% of women in 1895 didn't want the right to vote. What about in any of the subsequent dozens of decades we've had since then? Have women collectively changed their minds on that? Can you find a majority of women now who think that them having the right to vote is a bad thing and they don't want it anymore? Rachel, did you vote in the last election? Or did you think my lady brain can't handle politics, I shouldn't be voting?
Great point.
I'd love to know that.
Great point. And it's not compulsory, right? Like, here's the thing I don't understand about this argument is like, she's saying women didn't want it. They thought politics was too icky for their lady brains and they couldn't get into it and they just didn't want to do it. And it's like, well, maybe some of them maybe did. I'm not going to argue that point. You're making a point about what was in somebody's brain 100 years ago. I'm not going to go there. I'm not even going to dignify that with trying to decide whether that's true or not. What I am going to say is it's not compulsory. We don't have compulsory voting. So if you have the right, you can still choose not to do it. So just don't do it. If you didn't want to do it before, you don't have to do it now. But the people who do want to do it get that equal right to do the same thing that men get to do. That's all it is. There's nothing. It's not like somebody's holding a gun to your head and forcing you to vote. It's a silly, dumb argument. Okay, next bit, we're skipping forward a little bit here now, and then they jump in to start talking about oppression.
It's just like the Democrats last night with their little reply to Trump's State of the Union, where they said the same thing. Oh, if you've been trying to protect your neighbors from the Gestapo who's coming to arrest them, we understand how stressful that is. They just create this completely false narrative. That's not how the world really works. Ask the average white man out there who he's oppressing, because most of them are just working hard as, Amazon delivery drivers or plumbers or sewage workers or something like that. The average white man has never had this incredible amount of power. It's all framing. The minute you take away and destroy the framing that everyone accepts, this all falls apart, which is why I wrote the book. Because I'm like, if women knew, specifically, women like me, this is supposed to be for us. This whole movement was supposed to be for me and my daughters to liberate us. And I was like, okay, from what? From the people who have the best interest in protecting me. My father, my husband, my brother, the men around me. In order to believe the feminist narrative that men have systemically just always wanted to keep women down and oppress them, you'd have to believe that they didn't care about their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, their grandmothers, their neighbor lady. Just all the men wanted to just systemically oppress the women so that they could have free maids and, sex bot women at home.
Do you think there's a difference between how people treat women as a whole versus women as individuals? Do you think there might be a difference there? Do you think there's a difference between how people treat other people that they're familiar with versus strangers? Do you think there might be a difference there? Individuals have prejudices, so they might think highly of a few women and dislike or think negatively of a lot of women or all the rest of the women. Systems oppress people. So people that may love you, they may not do anything to change the system that actually oppresses you. So they could love you very deeply, but never actually want to change how society treats you. None of this is hard to understand. You're making a completely false narrative, and you're trying to say most people don't have privilege. Most people don't recognize that they have privilege. I think that's the most important piece to remember here. Here she's talking about how women aren't very good at things and everything in the world is built by men.
And I think that in the modern era, all the feminist side debate, they live in this world that we're sitting in this studio right now, and all this wonderful stuff that allows me to be here talking to you and talking to all the folks that are watching, the microphone, the technology, everything was built by men. You'll hear the Hedy Lamarr thing that she came up with Wi-Fi. No, it's not true.
Really?
No, it's not true.
What do you mean?
She worked with a man on a precursor to it, but it wasn't her. It wasn't like she
Were they
by
fucking?
her. I think so. I think they actually were. I think it was one of her boyfriends. I could be wrong on that, but no, if you even if you just ask Grok, is that really true? And it's like, well, a little bit, but not really.
Right.
But far and away, men are the builders and maintainers of infrastructure and technology. And they always will be, because the truth is women have had 100 years to get into that stuff, and they just don't really want to. They'd rather be interior designers or psychologists or things that are, about people and social dynamics and, aesthetics and stuff like that. I'm that way too. I have a really strong intellectual, logical side. I love debating and all that kind of stuff. But I also love smelling babies' heads and dressing them in cute little outfits. And, I love glitter and sparkly things. So it is what it is. Women don't want to go be men.
Right.
That's what we're finding out after 100 years of this, is that when you make women be men, they hate it.
So, yeah, it's fine. Look, women have had 100 years trying to get into careers with absolutely no barriers or hurdles at all. So everything has to be fine.
Right.
And they've had, 50 years of even being allowed their own bank accounts as well. So why aren't they making everything in the entire world around us? It must just be that they like glitter and the smell of babies more than men do. This is such a facile argument that I don't think she'd have made this argument if she hadn't just had 90 minutes of Joe buying every little thing that she sells. Because this isn't your opening gambit.
No.
Especially for someone who isn't. She's not there because of how much she loves the smell of babies' heads and glitter. She's there because she has a business where she's written this book and written courses and has a YouTube business. Yeah. She's in the workplace. There's no doubt about that. But she's managed to pull the wool over Joe's eyes here.
Yeah. Women have had 100 years to become president. Why haven't they become president yet? Geez, get on it, women. Come on. What's your problem? It's your fault.
Kamala Harris just loved glitter too much. Hillary Clinton was all about smelling the baby's head.
Somebody handed her a baby and she smelled the head of the baby, and that was it. That was the end of her campaign. It was it. That was over.
That's the real content of that Frazzle Drip video. It's her smelling a baby, smelling it so much.
That's what it was. Yeah. But she was smelling it after she cut the face off of it. So it's like a whole different type of thing. Look, nobody is suggesting that women be men. They're just saying that they should have equal opportunities for the same pay and similar jobs. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all they want, is the opportunity. They don't want to be men. That's such a bad argument. Okay. She shifts to talk about raising kids in this next clip.
Well, it's just such a bizarre perspective to think that it's not a huge task to raise children.
Yeah.
And to care for them and communicate with them and see to their emotional needs and help them solve things and figure things out and help them with their schoolwork and just normal stuff that is so crucial to the development of a child.
Yeah.
And we've somehow, because there's no monetary, you can't put a number on that, how valuable it is. It's not valuable. If it's not bringing in money, if it's not contributing to the GDP.
Yes.
Yeah.
No one thinks it's easy to raise kids. They just don't want to be forced to do it. They want to have other avenues in their life. How hard is that to understand?
Yeah, exactly. And Joe is saying, look, it's hard to do all these different things. You'll see to their emotional needs and care for them and communicate with them. Nothing about doing any of that requires a vagina. You can be a man and you can help your kids with the homework and see to their emotional needs.
Sure.
In fact, you should be doing that anyway. If you're not willing to do that, don't have kids.
Yeah.
That's your role as a parent. And it's just interesting because contrast Joe saying that to the way Joe talked to Matthew McConaughey when they talked about how important it is to be a supportive partner and a supportive father. Now Joe is kind of accepting Rachel's framing that that's just women's work. That's for women to do.
Great point. All right, next bit is about unpaid labor.
Like myth of women's unpaid labor. I'm glad you brought that up. I just finished a huge project that I'm working on with Andrew, my excellent handsome husband, and Stephen Crowder, Dr. David Patrick Harry, and Rob Knorr, who's a champion debater. We put together a feminist debate course that's coming out really soon. I think this week. I think it drops this week. And we go over all these myths and debunk them, and we show people and demonstrate like how to debate this feminism thing, because it's a leviathan. It's a beast. If you take it on, like, one of the reasons I'm out here doing it is because when men try to argue against feminism or feminists, they immediately get slapped with, you're a misogynist, you hate women, you're an incel, all the tropes. You have a small dick. What are you, gay? Like, just all the insults, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when I sit in front of them and make those arguments, you can't really just get away with that. You have to contend with them because I'm a woman.
Right.
I mean, you could try to insult me, but it's not going to land the same as when you do that to a man. So we put together this course to try to help people deconstruct the framing that's been built, question all the founding axioms that feminism was this good, necessary grassroots thing, that it's good for women, that if it ever went away, all the women would be chained to the stove in servitude, not allowed to learn how to read or drive a car.
So, yeah, like, she's talking about women's unpaid labor, and she talks about this project that she's working on. I'm pretty sure her work on that project isn't unpaid labor. I'm pretty sure all of that work is paid labor. But what a complete coincidence that her How to Beat Feminist course drops the week she's doing the How to Beat Feminist pitch on Joe's show, just completely by coincidence here. This is what I said this at the start. This is a woman who wants us to believe women shouldn't have jobs. And yet she's out here doing promo for the huge project she spent 2.5 years, reading and writing and researching on. And now she's here selling it. That's what this is. This is just a sales pitch for women like me shouldn't do the things that I'm doing. Buy my book.
This is the last in the main event. This is some advice to women.
That's why I said we give women backwards advice. We tell them spend all your fertile years building an education and a career, and then later, if there's time for a family, maybe you can do that if you want to be weird. What we should tell women, I think, is you can do a lot of things. I'm not saying you only have children and you never do anything else, and that was never the case historically. It was never the case. I had my first child at 20. I had my last one at 32. I got a lot of living, God willing, that I'll be able to do other things. I'm doing this now. Once I have grandkids, you'll probably never see me again because hopefully I'll be doing a lot with that. I'll have time to do things for my church, for my community. I could do anything I want. I can garden. I can write books. There's a million things you could do. And that was always the case. This idea that women didn't have choices before feminism is nuts. They were writing novels. They were supporting themselves, doing all kinds of other things. And what's happened after feminism is now I think you don't have many choices. Because like my daughters, my second oldest is like, I would love to just get married right now and have kids. But like, how do we pay for it? What do I do until I find a husband? Like between 18, say I don't find a guy till I'm 23. What do I do for those 5 years? Just stay at home and twiddle my thumbs? Like, what do I do? Do I get a job? She feels like she doesn't have choices. She would love to stay home and have kids.
Notice at the start there, she says about, we've got the advice the wrong way around. We send women off to work during their fertile years and then say to them, she says, and later, if there's time for a family, maybe you can do that if you want to be weird. Society isn't saying that last bit about wanting it being weird to want to have a family. She has to add that in because otherwise it sounds reasonable. She has to just kind of discredit here.
Yeah.
Listen to what she's actually advocating for. She's saying, women, you should stay home have your kids first, and then after that, you're going to have choices like gardening or doing things for your church or writing books. You know, entirely accessible things that are available to anyone who hasn't spent any time in their life building up a career and an income and a nest egg. Perfectly reasonable things.
Yeah.
And yeah, I could be wrong. I'm not persuaded by her argument that when her grandkids come along, she'll just disappear because she'll be too busy and too happy to be just looking after them. And the reason I think that is she's out here right now promoting the business that she's part of and the content that she sells to make a living. Yeah. I'd be surprised if she's just planning to turn her back on the entire business she's built because her kid has had a kid.
Yeah. This is exactly what feminism wants. Feminism is literally about the choice to decide to do these things. Some people decide that they don't want to have children, so they don't have children, and they should have every opportunity to go into the workforce if that's what they want to do. That's cool. Without feminism, there is no choice. They don't get the opportunity to do that. So what they get to do is exactly what you said, and everybody who's a woman has the exact same path. They don't have any deviation on that. Why do you care? If your kid wants to do this, let your kid do this. Let your kid have this life that they want to have. No one is oppressing them and saying that they can't do it. The only people that are doing that is the economy that's saying that that's a real tough life that you're suggesting. We can change all those things and it would be perfectly fine. I think like she's saying at the end, the child wants to like they want to have this ability, but they just don't have the means to do it. Are they asking to be sold off to another person? Because that's what we did for a real long time with women. We used to sell them off to other families so they could be baby machines. Is that what we want to go back to? Is that the world that we want to rewind to? I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that you should be able to support yourself whilst having kids is something feminism is fighting for. It's fighting for exactly those things. You should be on board, but you're not because you have this thin, two-dimensional version of the evil straw man of feminism.
Yeah.
There's a point that we didn't include because it would have been just too long, but Joe asks about what about the families that do need two incomes to survive? You know, it's all well and good to say we should be on one income, but what about the times right now where people need two incomes? What's your solution to that? And her advice is, well, in her case, her husband earns really good money. And also they moved somewhere cheaper to live. And she took a job as a firearms instructor working 1 day a week. And that seemed to do it for her. How realistic is that advice for anyone else? Yeah. She's saying like she's trying to remake society based around this single income. And when she's put on the spot and asked to come up with a solution to the problem, she comes up with this because she isn't looking to solve the real problems people have. She and her husband are ideologues that have a business pushing a specific worldview, which has no real connection to reality or the problems that their content consumers are actually facing. Even her version of women should stay home and not work involves her getting a part-time job. That was her solution there. It's like, don't work, just get a part-time job.
All right, we're going to move on to our toolbox section.
How you doing? Like, and now he's got like a new tool in his toolbox.
So for the toolbox this time, Marsh, we're doing poisoning the well and the genetic fallacy.
Yeah, so these kind of go a bit hand in hand, but essentially this is all about attacking the source of a claim by showing the person who made that claim in a perceived negative light, even if that light is completely unrelated to the veracity of the claim itself. You know, don't go to John you can't trust him as a tailor because his mum was a drunkard. Well, unless his drunk mum is doing the sewing of your clothes, how much alcohol his mum did or didn't drink has nothing to do with the quality of his tailoring. And often this will be brought up in a way that your reaction will be to say, well, no, his mum isn't a drunkard, actually. I think that's unfair because actually, and you start to engage with what is the well poisoning rather than saying, sorry, this has nothing to do with John's tailoring ability. I'm not even going to answer. I'm not even going to entertain this whole side strand about his mum being drunk because it's irrelevant to the point that we're actually discussing. And this happens all the way through this whole interview.
And that's that last piece that you say is very important because I think some people, when they listen to the show, may expect us to listen to the show and debunk every single thing that is false in a show. And in this case, we're not going to go through through the history part of this because it's not relevant, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not she's talking about these figures, and if they did the things that they did, that doesn't matter to the point that she's trying to make. So we're not going to, much of this isn't going to be us very carefully dissecting the history of what she's saying, but instead just looking at the logic she's using and saying, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and what she wants us to do is engage with what she's saying.
Yes.
Because that is the distraction that poisoning the well is. You can't say we're not talking about the merits of feminism because we're talking about the personal flaws of individual feminists and whether these are real or not.
Okay, so she starts out, this is going to be out 40 minutes into the show. She starts talking about Susan B. Anthony.
How did Susan B. Anthony get involved in all this? Because she was one of those people that was like, what was she on the $2 bill or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. And she was one of those people that was always held up as this like amazing woman. And then I started listening to your book and I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. A lot of these women, like her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were kind of the two big figureheads in America. There were a lot of other important people, but those are the two most people have heard of. They're the ones who wrote The History of Women's Suffrage, which is this giant, like, multi-volume history that they wrote. Now, they wrote it from a very biased perspective to make themselves the rock stars of this movement. They wanted to be remembered in the history books as being these awesome, badass, kind of revolutionary, strong, independent women. They, in fact, came up with the strong, independent woman narrative, that women were victims who needed to be unvictimized. They had other suffragists that they were trying to cut out of the history when they were putting together this history of women's suffrage. Lucy Stone was one that said, wait a minute, you guys are leaving out huge chunks of important information, like the fact that our main support comes from men, progressive men, and socialist men and polygamist men. Like, why are you guys leaving this out? If you do it, like, everyone's going to know you just didn't mention any of that. Because at the time, it was like super well known. They had a lot of PR problems in the suffrage movement because it was known as something that prostitutes, socialists, Marxists, polygamists, and revolutionaries were into. And she was like, you can't leave that out. It's like a main point. Maybe you don't like how it portrays us, but you got to include it. So they like reluctantly did include some of that, but they were going to try to leave it out altogether and frame it, as we know it now, as a fight of women against men. This fight of oppressed women against the oppressive patriarchy that was systemically trying to keep a boot on women's necks. And even their own colleagues were like, that ain't how it happened.
Yeah, so they were trying to whitewash over the real history and just make it look like it was women against men. Now, obviously, feminism isn't against men. It's against patriarchy specifically. But the bigger point here is this is just poisoning the well. Prostitutes, socialists, Marxists, polygamists, and revolutionaries, they were into suffrage. So suffrage must be a bad thing. We can't talk about the relative merits of giving women the vote because what we are talking about is, don't polygamists and prostitutes like that? Thank you.
I don't think it's helpful to dig into the history to find out whether she's right about the personal motivations of people and their personal interactions with each other. The motivations behind the suffrage movement aren't necessary to understand the outcome and the benefits of the suffrage movement. So we don't have to pay attention to the motivations of any of these people. That's not necessary to know whether or not what they did was a good thing. And also, look what she's trying to tie feminism to. Right? Feminism is tied to the people who were prostitutes because feminism itself is impure and prostitutes are impure. It's tied to polygamists for the same reason. She tries, and she will in a couple of these clips, try to tie it to scam artists and occultists. That's the exact same reason she's doing this. She's trying to basically say they're rejecting the natural order. And the natural order means, women in the home, women don't have any power. And the ones who want to change it, they're bad people inherently, and they're trying to trick you into doing this bad thing. Next, she talks about Victoria Woodhull.
There were other motivations too, like Victoria Woodhull was a famous feminist. She was the first one to have like a big newspaper. She was known as Mrs. Satan because she was into free love. She wanted to make prostitution legal. She said that marriage was just a legal form of prostitution. She saw it to be no different than regular old run-of-the-mill prostitution. She was like really radical. She was also a scam artist. Like the thing I found when I was looking into the histories of all these women, they were into the occult or very anti-Christian because they saw it as patriarchal and oppressive. they were usually con artists or scammers. So spiritualism and snake oil salesman was like really big and popular at the time. This lady sold fake cancer cures. She was wanted in like 4 different states for selling fake cancer cures to dying people and scamming them out of their money. And by pushing suffrage, she got a lot of people to fund her and give her money. And one of them was Cornelius Vanderbilt. And she would pretend to be able to contact the dead. She would say she could contact like ancient Greeks and all these spirits, like the spirit of Abraham Lincoln was coming to her in dreams and stuff. I don't think Cornelius believed that at all. But what he did know about her was that she did run a prostitution ring. And all her friends were hookers who worked the Wall Street gentlemen. And so she basically had a spy network of prostitutes who would give her insider trading information. He used that to game the stock market on the first Black Friday, I think it was like 1889, for today's equivalent of $26 million, according to the New York Times. And when the New York Times interviewed him and said, how did you come out 26 million? Well, at the time it was 1.3, but today's money, 26 million. How did you pull this off when everybody else has just lost their ass? And he said, do as I do, consult the spirits. So he said that this woman had contacted the dead and given him the tip that way. But it was really just she had a prostitution ring. So these were the people involved, okay? And this is what they were really doing.
These are the people involved, and this is what they were really doing. We're learning here that suffrage is bad because this lady was a scam artist who was into free love and who knew prostitutes. Therefore, women shouldn't have the vote, I guess, is her point here. And so, like I said, we're not going to go into the details necessarily in every single one. You said the same thing. There are some details we will kind of go into.
You can't hold Marsh back, guys.
You can't hold him back. She said she was a scam artist, a con artist. Now, she was the seventh of 10 children, and her father was a con man and a snake oil salesman, and her mother was a follower of spiritualism. And that's the world she grew up in, with her father doing that. The con artist accusation was about her father. But I guess Rachel thinks the 11-year-old Victoria didn't do enough to denounce her dad's career. Maybe it's because, according to her biography, her father regularly whipped her.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, maybe as a child, she did join in the family business rather than be whipped as many times. But that is enough evidence to say that all of suffrage is bad because of what she was about here. This is just a quote that I found from an article about Woodhull spoke out in person against prostitution and considered marriage for material gain a form of prostitution. But in her journal, she expressed support for the legalization of prostitution. So when she says in this clip here that she said marriage was just a form of legal prostitution, that is a mischaracterization, and I would argue maybe a deliberate mischaracterization of what she said. She said if you're marrying just for personal gain is essentially a form of prostitution. But then she was kind of pro-legalization. So yeah, we're just poisoning this well left, right, and center.
It's interesting that Rachel brings up, she says, well, she was out there selling fake cancer cures. Lady, the guy you're talking to believes chemotherapy is a fake cancer cure.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. And Victoria apparently was talking to the dead too. Like Joe would have her on the show if she was still alive. And a man and a billionaire.
Well, she doesn't have to be on the show. He could maybe get a medium in there, and then she could be on the show just fine.
There we go.
Listen to this and the previous clip, and the rest of them we're gonna play for you. And I think it's important to remember that the thing you hear from the debate bro side and from Joe Rogan very often is that if we discuss the merits of these arguments, the best one will win. This is the marketplace of idea argument that they put out all the time. They say, look, let's just open these up. We'll open them up to the broad light of day. We'll say the merits of this one, the merits of this one, and then we'll make a decision based on logic. But they're never really doing that in this. They never bring up any of the points about feminism. Instead, she's just literally poisoning the well with ad hominem attacks against the people who she wants to attack to say they were impure, and therefore your brain's going to make the connection that feminism itself is impure because it was created by impure people. So this doesn't ever address any of the positive things about feminism. All it does is attack the people who initially were the ones who pushed for it to become a thing. Now we're going to talk about Margaret Sanger.
And the other big secret is she was getting a lot of money. She was getting paid by the Rockefeller Foundation and promoted by people like H.G. Wells, who she was also having an affair with. They're all a bunch of creepers, Joe. I'm telling you. She was
It sounded like it.
Yeah,
she
she
sounded
was
like an insane
married.
person in the book.
Yeah, she was married and had 3 kids. She left her kids in like hippie bohemian communities. One of them died from neglect in one of these communities. Didn't care about her kids at all. In fact, one of her sons grew up and said, my sister would not be dead if my mother gave any shits about us whatsoever, but she didn't. She was anywhere except where we were. Any excuse to leave. She let her ex-husband take the rap for her distributing illegal stuff about like abortion and birth control. That the Comstock laws didn't allow that back then. So she was wanted in court and was going to be put in jail for distributing that stuff. She let her husband take the fall for it while she went to England and had affairs with people like H.G. Wells and Havelock Ellis. And they were all bisexual and they were all occultists and doing all this crazy stuff. But H.G. Wells called her the most incredible woman ever to live and said that she was going to have more impact on the future of humanity than any other person.
This episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. When you want to train your dog, you don't want just any rando off the streets who likes animals.
I had to leave the ad line in there just to show.
Good.
I mean, I don't know how ZipRecruiter feel about being tied to this. But look, Margaret Sanger, who was, one of the pioneers of access to abortion in America, she was having an affair. Therefore, abortion must be bad. Also, she was bisexual. Therefore, abortion must be bad. Also, she was an occultist. Therefore, abortion must be bad. None of this speaks to whether abortion is good or bad. Even, I don't think there's any evidence that she was an occultist, but even if she thought she was an occultist, that would say nothing about the ethical or otherwise merits of abortion.
Yeah. Half the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders, so they were unbearably unethical people. But they created something that was a pretty good model for government. Even if someone does something objectively bad, we can certainly argue that much of what she's saying here isn't actually bad. I mean, we could say that. We could just point out being bisexual isn't a bad trait. That's okay. But even still, even if we were to take her at her word that some of the things that they were doing were absolutely bad, that doesn't mean that someone can do something that is good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even on your point about the people who signed the Declaration, I imagine plenty of those had affairs and extramarital sex, sometimes with their slaves. Yeah. But we don't look at, she doesn't look back at them with the same kind of opprobrium. Look, Margaret Sanger wasn't a good person. We don't have to deny that or defend her to say that we still think women should have control over their bodies and their reproductive rights. They are just separate conversations, and you're just trying to poison the idea of abortion by bringing up these things about Margaret Sanger.
Exactly. Next, clips about birth control.
Why do you think he thought that?
Because he was a eugenicist who loved the idea of millions of abortions a year.
H.G. Wells, the War of the Worlds guy, was a eugenicist.
Yep. You should have Jay Dyer on to tell you about H.G. Wells. I brought you his book.
I don't want to know. I love the War of the Worlds.
He wrote some great fiction, but he was a diehard Malthusian. These people really believed. It was actually a very popular thing. That we're talking right after Darwinism. We're talking about just before the Nazis. We're talking about the Kaiser Wilhelm Foundation. It was a very popular position to be in favor of social hygiene, as they called it, which was, anybody with birth defects shouldn't be able to reproduce. Anybody of the lower races or inferior mentally, any of those kind of people shouldn't reproduce because we want, a cleaner, better human race going forward.
Oof.
Yeah. So feminism was instrumental in that. That's actually where the birth control pill came from as well. Margaret Sanger, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Kaiser Wilhelm Foundation, and a lot of Nazi scientists are the ones who started synthesizing human hormones to make birth control pills.
Could we make this any clearer that this is poison in the well here, right? Just look at the framing. Eugenics slots in between Darwinism and the Nazis. There is a straight line. According to her, abortion and birth control are linked to those three evil things, according to her. Now, I would agree eugenics and Nazism are bad. I don't think Darwinism is anywhere near the same kind of conversation. And I don't think, even if the people who created birth control were Darwinist, eugenicist Nazis, it doesn't say anything about whether it's good for women to be able to control their reproductive health. This is just a genetic fallacy. It's poisoning the well.
Yeah, I mean, a car can be used to get you to work, or you can drive it into a large crowd and kill a bunch of people as a deadly weapon. It's how you use the car that matters. So the same with birth control. Putting people on birth control against their will, or forcing people, or focusing birth control on a certain population, that's horrible. Absolutely. That doesn't mean that birth control can't have a use, or doesn't have a use, or isn't used to help people. Again, you're making it seem like this stuff is inherently evil because of its origins, because who it was linked to. That's all just bullshit, and you're not really addressing whether or not birth control can have some great effects in society and allow people the opportunity to decide when they want to have children. Okay, now she brings up a famous feminist, Simone de Beauvoir.
That aside, for just a moment, Simone de Beauvoir, arguably the biggest feminist of second wave, the French intellectual who was buddies with Jean-Paul Sartre, and they got in trouble for grooming underage kids and seducing them and all kinds of crazy stuff. But she's respected as the greatest feminist intellectual of the 20th century, and she was super influential. And in a 1970s interview with Betty Friedan, she said, "I don't believe that society should give women the opportunity or the choice to stay home and be mothers, because if we do, they're all going to pick that. And I don't think it should be an option." So
oh my God.
it was the view of the feminists that, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that. They said, we would have never passed suffrage had it not been for men. If it was ever left up to women alone, we would have never passed suffrage. They would have never gone for it. They don't want liberation. Now,
they didn't have the vote. They couldn't have passed suffrage.
Anyway.
You needed men.
Yeah.
You obviously needed it. So look, let's talk about Simone de Beauvoir. Now, according to at least 3 women, Simone de Beauvoir sexually exploited them while they were 16 or 17 when she was a teacher. She was their teacher and she was in her 30s. That's bad. It makes her a bad person. Therefore, what? Women shouldn't be in the workforce now? Women shouldn't have the vote now? Abortion's bad? Like, what point is she using that exploitation to support? And the answer is she isn't. She isn't saying this isn't to support any of her arguments other than feminism's bad because look at this bad person. This is just poisoning the well. You can want equality for women even if Simone de Beauvoir groomed teenage girls. Simone de Beauvoir does not own or define feminism.
Yeah.
And even if she invented feminism, which she fucking didn't, it wouldn't mean that today's feminists have to stop being feminists because she was a bad person. And the other thing I'll mention is, if you're going to do a drive-by mention of Simone de Beauvoir's sexual abuse in order to decry a worldview she believed in and promoted, you're now just exploiting her victims for your own end. You aren't on the side of the victims here at all.
Yeah. I mean, if that by that logic, what should we think of MAGA?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Next up, this is where they're talking about aesthetics.
We couldn't convince them for 100 years. We had to convince the men that don't you want your daughters to like have their own money and this and that? So the feminists themselves say women didn't want it. If we ever left it up to women, they wouldn't have ever chosen it, like at least not as a whole. Sure, there would always have been a minority, but I would argue that the minority of women who fought for that were the ones that the status quo historically of get yourself a good man, have a family, stay home, it doesn't work for them. So like a lot of them, there's a book about this, Edward Dutton wrote a book about witches, feminism, and the fall of the West, where he says traditionally, like women, the archetype of the witch being ugly and haggard and living on the outside of town, it's kind of historically accurate. Most of the feminists, like, have you ever seen a picture of Susan B. Anthony, for example?
I have not.
She is aesthetically challenged, we'll say that.
Mm-hmm.
So is Betty Friedan. So are a lot of these women. Not all, but a lot of them are.
And
I think
of men were not really interested in them.
I think they look at the system and they go, well, this isn't fair to me.
Look how unattractive these specific women are. Therefore, feminism is bad. Therefore, what? Women shouldn't have equal pay. Therefore, there shouldn't be a gender pay gap. Therefore, what? It's nothing. This is just poison the well. Genetic fallacy again. The men weren't really interested in them. I'm not being funny. I imagine for some of the women, they weren't interested in the men either. There was a whole sexual liberation thing going on at the same time as well. But it's funny because literally earlier in this conversation, we didn't include it because it didn't quite fit with the main or the toolbox. They were talking about how attractive Gloria Steinem was, how she was undercover in the Playboy mansion to show how the Playboy bunnies were being exploited. And Joe goes away, and we may even cover it in the gloves off, and finds a picture of her online and immediately objectifies her. And elsewhere, they're talking about how Taylor Swift and Beyonce are such feminists because capitalism means, and they'll get rewarded so much more by saying they're feminists. But apparently, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and how attractive Gloria Steinem was doesn't invalidate this argument that feminists are only feminists because they're too ugly to get a guy.
Yeah, and also just look at the framing of the argument. You're framing it to say how they should feel worth to a man, right?
Yeah.
Look at how we're even framing this argument, that it's about the male gaze on whether or not these women should feel worth in their life. Listen to what you're saying, for crying out loud. All right, now we're going to get into the occult version of this. This is where they try to combine Luciferianism and humanism.
Luciferians emphasize self-improvement, free will, and intellectual pursuit over traditional religious dogma. They view Lucifer as a light bringer or liberator, often drawing from pre-Christian figures like Prometheus. Practices may include ceremonial magic, but the focus is typically on personal empowerment rather than the worship of evil. But that's a trapdoor, ain't it?
Yes, it is.
That's what it seems like.
Exactly what it is.
It seems like a trapdoor. Just the way they describe it, you're like, oh, well, that's me, man. I'm into self-improvement.
And that's
I do
where
cold
you
plunges.
get. That's why we're all God. I'm God. And that's where you get moral relativism. Secular humanism comes from Luciferianism, by the way. And in the 20th century, almost all the feminists signed like the humanist manifestos and things like that. The secular humanism stuff where it's like morality is subjective. What's right for you at the time is what's right, and what's right or wrong for me at the time. And there is no objective moral facts.
So just look at what she's tying together here. Humanism came out of Luciferianism and therefore is bad. And therefore the well is poisoned.
Yeah.
If you're a humanist, you also worship Lucifer. Oh, that's where it came from.
I just want to point out, I know lots of people know this, but I just want to mention it, that Satanists, Luciferian type people who define themselves like that, they often choose language to define themselves like that because they want to point out that nothing is sacred, that these concepts aren't sacred, and they choose those very specific words because they know that it basically says there is no de facto truth, and the truth that you're trying to tell me, this objective truth that you're trying to say that God is good, I'm rejecting that. And so it's very specifically choosing that language based in the mythology that people believe, most people believe.
Yeah. Also, Joe, I'm fairly sure Lucifer isn't on board with cold plunges. I don't think cold plunges are his thing.
Hot plunges? Outstanding.
Hot
Cold
plunges. Yeah, exactly.
Not into it. All right. This is the last clip in our toolbox. This is just talking about occult feminism, guys.
What this really comes down to, like the name of the book is Occult Feminism. It has two meanings. The first meaning is a lot of these women were really into the occult.
Right.
That's the most obvious one. But the second one is occult. The term itself just means hidden. And there's a whole history here that's been completely intentionally hidden from both women and men, but specifically from women, that if they knew it, I think they'd have a whole different view of this movement, and they would question a lot of its foundational grounding axioms and all the presuppositions we have that it was to protect women.
I just love this because even the title of her book, Occult Feminism, is itself a well poisoning. She's poisoning the well with the very title of the book here. And she's admitting it.
Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
Okay, Marsh, here we are at the end. Something good in this?
I would say the only good thing is I came away with a list of pretty awesome sounding feminists to look up from the olden days.
And I came away with a list of books to avoid. So I think we have really won it on this one. This is definitely a home run for us. Yeah, there's nothing good in this. This is 2.5 hours of them basically rehashing the exact same points that we pointed out in the hour and a half that it took us. But yeah, these are bad history, genetic fallacies, and then very specifically just trying to sell a worldview in a book to Joe's audience. That's basically what it was.
Just a deeply regressive worldview that not even the author lives by, because she is not living by
very true.
The standards she says women ought to live by.
Very true. Okay, so that's it for this week's show. Remember that you can access more than a half-hour bonus content every single week for as little as $1 an episode by subscribing at patreon.com/NoRogan. And that's ad-free episodes as well. Meanwhile, you can hear more from me at Cognitive Dissonance and Citation Needed. And you can hear more from Marsh at Skeptics with a K and the Skeptic podcast. And we'll be back next week for a little more, the No Rogan Experience. If you love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to norogan.com, KNOWROGAN.com.